I wasn't even in their family photo. And that's when it hit me. My mother had let my stepfather erase me. That photo wasn't just a picture. It was a declaration. There stood Carl, my stepfather, grinning with his two sons on either side of him, my mother, Sandra, holding their hands like they were her only children. I wasn't there. Not by accident. Not because I was running late. I simply wasn't invited. And that's when the ugly truth sunk in. I was never meant to be part of their family. I'm Oliver, 17 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've lived in a house where I've been treated like a ghost. Ever since Carl moved in with his 2 boys, he made it clear that I was the outsider. But it wasn't the yelling or fighting that got to me. It was the silence. Carl never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His weapon was pretending I didn't exist. And his sons followed his lead, as if they had been coached to treat me like I was invisible. My mother, she told me to understand Carl, that after all the sacrifices she had made for me, the least I could do was make peace with the man who wouldn't even look at me. I never asked her to make those sacrifices. She chose them. But somehow, my existence had become an inconvenience in her new family narrative. I endured the cold shoulders, the silent dinners, and being the extra chair at the table because I loved my mom. I told myself that maybe, eventually, Carl would come around. Maybe his sons would realize I wasn't the enemy. But the older I got, the more clear it became they didn't want me there. I wasn't part of their plan. Then came the final insult, the vacation. One morning, I woke up to an empty house. No note, no text, no mention of a trip. They had packed up and left, Carl, his 2 sons, and my mother, for a beach getaway and had left me behind like I was just part of the furniture. I wasn't furious because I was excluded from a family trip. I was furious because they didn't even think I deserved to know. That moment wasn't just a wake-up call. It was a breaking point.
The silent treatment didn't end with Carl. When his 2 sons, Ryan and Mason, officially moved into our house, it was like watching my invisibility multiply. These weren't bad kids. At least, they didn't start out that way. But living under Carl's influence twisted them into reflections of him. If Carl could pretend I didn't exist, his sons were eager to take it further. They didn't yell at me, didn't bully me outright. Instead, they whispered inside jokes at the dinner table, laughed in hushed tones while throwing side glances, and made sure I knew I wasn't part of their conversations. It was subtle. So subtle, in fact, that if I ever dared to bring it up, I sounded like the petty one. "You're imagining things," Mom would say with a sigh, exhausted before the conversation even started. But it wasn't my imagination. I lived it every single day. The house became a space where I was both physically present and socially erased. Every room I walked into, conversations would stop. Every comment I made would be met with silence. Or worse, exchanged glances between Carl and his boys, as if I spoken in a language they didn't deem worthy of a reply. I tried to approach my mom gently at first. After all, this wasn't her fault. At least, that's what I told myself. I'd wait until we were alone. Maybe after dinner, when Carl and his sons were glued to the TV, and I'd tell her how isolated I felt. Her response never changed. "Oliver, I need you to understand something," she'd begin, using that soft, weary tone like I was a child who didn't grasp adult sacrifices. "I've given up so much for you. Carl has had to adjust too. You're old enough now to meet me halfway. He's trying in his own way. The least you can do is try too. It was like being scolded for asking to be treated like a human being. Every time I brought up how suffocating it was to live in a home where no one acknowledged me, it turned into a conversation about her sacrifices, her career opportunities she passed up, the men she turned away for my sake, the life she could have had if I hadn't come along. Those words weren't said outright, but they hung in the air between us, unspoken but loud. Every guilt trip left me feeling like I owed her silence in return for existing. But it wasn't just her words. It was the way she avoided eye contact when I mentioned Carl. The way her posture would tense, as if siding with me would disrupt the fragile balance she was so desperate to maintain. I started to realize that my feelings weren't just being ignored, they were being packaged as ungratefulness. The narrative became simple. Carl wasn't the problem. I was. I was the difficult one who couldn't adapt. I was the reason the house wasn't peaceful. The walls of my home, once filled with conversations between me and Mom, were now thin barriers that trapped my frustration. Every joke Ryan and Mason cracked at my expense, every smirk Carl gave when I entered a room made me feel like I was a stranger in my own home. But what hurt the most was my mom's silence. She didn't need to join in their cold war against me. Her indifference was betrayal enough. I stopped trying after a while. There's only so many times you can extend a hand before you realize it's never going to be taken. My bedroom became my only refuge, a space where I could breathe without feeling like a nuisance. But even that sanctuary felt tainted. The walls were thin, and I could hear their laughter. Laughter I was never part of. The hardest part was knowing that it didn't have to be this way. I wasn't asking for a perfect family. I wasn't even asking to be loved by Carl or his kids. I just wanted to be treated like I mattered. But in that house, my existence was an inconvenience, a glitch in their perfect family photo. And my mom, the one person who should have seen me, chose to look away.
What finally broke me wasn't a fight or a confrontation. It was silence. One summer morning, I woke up to an empty house. No warning, no note, just silence. The night before had been business as usual. Carl ignoring me, his kids cracking jokes in the living room, while Mom sat there trying to pretend we were one big happy family. There wasn't a single mention of any plans. So when I came downstairs and realized the entire house was deserted, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. I called Mom immediately. She picked up, sounding cheerful, like nothing was wrong. "Oh, honey, we're on a quick road trip, just for a few days. Carl and the boys wanted to get away." Her tone was light, casual, like she was telling me she'd gone to the grocery store, not left me alone, without notice. I tried to stay calm. "You didn't think to tell me?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "You just left." "Well," she sighed, "you're on summer break. I thought you wouldn't mind holding down the fort. It's just for a week." Hold down the fort. That's what I was to her now. A security system. Not a son. Not family. Just someone to keep the lights on while they played house without me. I could barely speak. "You didn't even ask me," I finally said. "I woke up alone. That's not okay." "Oh, come on, Oliver," she replied, the annoyance creeping into her voice. "You're being dramatic. You're 16. You should be able to handle a week alone." It wasn't about handling it. I could have managed the empty house just fine. What crushed me was the fact that they didn't even bother to tell me. They didn't care enough to include me, not even to inform me. I wasn't part of their plans, because to them, I wasn't part of their family. After she hung up, I stared at the walls of that house, the silence suddenly deafening. Every inch of it screamed that I didn't belong. And the worst part? I had no one to talk to. I had been arguing with a few of my friends, so reaching out felt impossible. The loneliness was suffocating. I tried calling Mom again later that afternoon, just to let her know I was leaving the house. She didn't pick up, straight to voicemail. I texted, "I'm heading to Dad's. House is locked. Keys under the planter." No response. Just silence. When I arrived at Dad's, he was surprised but welcoming. He didn't ask questions at first. He just saw the look on my face and nodded. Later that night, I told him everything. I started with how Carl treated me like I was invisible, how his sons followed his lead like they'd been trained to ignore me. I told him how Mom always dismissed it, always acted like it was my job to understand Carl's behavior. And then I told him about the trip, how they'd left without a word, how I woke up alone in that house, expected to just accept it, how Mom didn't even answer my calls after that first brush-off. As I talked, something cracked open inside me. All the feelings I'd been burying, confusion, resentment, sadness, they poured out. I started crying before I could stop myself. I hadn't realized how much I'd been carrying, how much it hurt to be so unwanted in your own home. Dad didn't say much at first. He just sat with me, listening. Then he said something I'll never forget. "You don't have to go back there, Oliver. Not if you don't want to." It was the first time someone had given me a choice. The first time anyone acknowledged that I deserved better. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't going back.
Days passed after I moved in with Dad, but the storm brewing at Mom's house wasn't close to calming down. I had cut off contact with her, choosing peace over pointless fights, but the universe wasn't done with me yet. It all started when Dad got a call from one of his old friends, someone who still had connections to Mom's social circle. What he told Dad left both of us stunned. Apparently, Carl had found out the truth, the real reason he had despised me for the last 3 years. It wasn't because of anything I had done. It wasn't my attitude. It wasn't teenage rebellion. No, it was because of a story my mom, Sandra, had spun during the early months of her relationship with Carl. A story so twisted it felt like a punch to the gut. Back when they were first dating, Carl had asked if he could move in with Mom and bring his ailing mother along. He wanted his kids and his mom to be under one roof, cared for, loved, and safe. But Mom wasn't comfortable with that. She wasn't ready to take on the responsibility of living with an elderly woman who needed constant attention. Instead of being upfront and honest with Carl, she did the unthinkable. She blamed me. She told Carl that I was a jealous, controlling son, that I had driven away every man she'd ever dated, that I hated the idea of sharing my home with strangers, and to top it off, she lied that I had referred to Carl's mother as a burden, and his kids as little gremlins. She crafted a narrative that made me sound like a toxic, manipulative kid who was the sole reason for her failed relationships. Carl believed her. He thought he was protecting his family by freezing me out. That's why he trained his sons not to talk to me. That's why he treated me like a ghost in my own home. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. It was about the lies my mother had built to avoid confrontation, lies that had spiraled into years of resentment and emotional isolation for me. Carl's discovery came accidentally, during a fight with Mom. The incident with the house break-in had triggered a chain reaction. Carl demanded answers as to why I had abandoned them. Sandra, under pressure, let something slip about how I was always too sensitive and overreacted to sharing space. Carl, connecting the dots, started asking questions. The more he pressed, the more holes appeared in Mom's story, until the entire facade crumbled. The truth hit Carl like a freight train. For 3 years, he had treated me like an enemy because of a lie my mother had crafted to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. Realizing this, Carl reached out to me, not through a phone call, but through an email. It was long, emotional, and surprisingly sincere. He apologized for everything. He admitted that he had let his anger and assumptions guide his actions, that he had believed the worst without giving me a chance. He said he felt like a fool, and while he didn't expect forgiveness, he wanted me to know that he saw me now, not as the villain of my mother's narrative, but as a kid who had been wronged. But that wasn't the only fallout. Carl also informed me in that same email that he had filed for divorce. He couldn't stay married to someone who had manipulated him so deeply. His words were heavy, filled with betrayal and disappointment. He said he should have questioned things earlier, that maybe, just maybe, he could have spared both of us years of pain. I didn't know how to feel. I sat with Dad reading that email over and over again. There was a strange relief in knowing that the coldness hadn't been my fault. But there was also a deep, hollow ache, because none of this could undo the years of damage. For the first time, Carl had reached out to me directly, and yet I couldn't even be angry at him anymore. I was too exhausted to hold on to rage. When Dad saw me sitting there, silent and shaken, he didn't push me to respond. He just said, "Son, you don't owe anyone a reaction. Not now. You take your time. You focus on you." And that's exactly what I intended to do.
Carl's email had been a turning point, but not in the way he had probably hoped. While his apology was heartfelt and his regret seemed genuine, it didn't change the fact that years of damage had already been done. For Oliver, this was no longer a matter of fixing a broken family. It was about reclaiming his own peace. He had spent far too long being invisible, being the scapegoat for his mother's lies. Now he was done. Michael, Oliver's father, had been quietly preparing the next steps. The day after they read Carl's email, Michael sat Oliver down and told him plainly, "I'm filing for full custody. You shouldn't ever have to go back to that house." There was no anger in his voice, just a calm, firm resolution that made Oliver feel, for the first time, protected. The following weeks were tense. Sandra, perhaps sensing that she was losing control, began bombarding both Oliver and Michael with messages. At first, they were syrupy sweet, filled with phrases like, "family is forever," and "we can get through this together." When those were met with silence, her tone shifted quickly into guilt-tripping accusations. "After everything I sacrificed for you, Oliver, this is how you repay me?" she texted. Another message to Michael demanded that he cover the expenses from the robbery, blaming him for filling Oliver's head with poison and turning him against his family. Michael didn't respond to her texts. He had already hired a lawyer and began the custody proceedings. Given Sandra's recent negligence, leaving Oliver home alone without informing him of her trip, the resulting burglary, and her blatant emotional manipulation, the case was straightforward. Michael's lawyer was confident they would win,
and she was right. Throughout the legal process, Sandra's desperation grew. She began posting dramatic, tearful videos on social media, painting herself as a misunderstood mother who was being torn away from her child. She conveniently left out the part where she had fabricated lies about Oliver to manipulate Carl. Friends and extended family began to take sides. Some reached out to Oliver, apologizing for ever believing Sandra's version of the story. Others, blinded by her theatrics, sent him accusatory messages. But Oliver had learned to tune it all out. He had Dad. He had clarity. And most importantly, he had control over his own life now. The custody hearing itself was quick. Sandra's lawyer attempted to paint a picture of a loving mother who had made mistakes out of fear of losing her son, but the evidence was overwhelming. The court had the texts, the call logs, and Carl's written statement admitting that he had mistreated Oliver based on Sandra's lies. It wasn't even a contest. Full custody was awarded to Michael, and Sandra was granted only supervised visitation rights. After the hearing, Sandra approached Oliver in the hallway. Her eyes were red, but there was still a sharpness in her voice. "Oliver, you're going to regret this. One day you'll see what you've lost." Oliver didn't flinch. "No, Mom. I see exactly what I've lost, and I'm better off without it." Michael put a protective hand on Oliver's shoulder, steering him away from the encounter. They walked out of the courthouse into the sunlight, a symbolic step into a life where Oliver no longer had to justify his existence. In the weeks that followed, Oliver felt the strange mix of emotions. Relief, mostly. Freedom. But also a lingering sadness for the relationship he had wished he could have with his mother, a relationship she had destroyed with her own hands. Carl, true to his word, gave Oliver space. He sent a few follow-up emails, apologizing again, and expressing his wish to make amends someday, but Oliver wasn't ready for that. Not yet. Maybe not ever. For now, he focused on building a life with his father, a life filled with mutual respect, understanding, and none of the emotional games that had clouded his past. Michael supported him unconditionally, encouraging him to pursue his passions, make new friends, and heal at his own pace. The house felt lighter. The silence was no longer suffocating. It was peaceful.
Looking back now, I realized the moment I chose to walk away wasn't just about leaving my mother's house. It was about reclaiming my worth. After years of being treated like an invisible guest in my own home, I finally understood that being family isn't about titles or shared bloodlines. It's about mutual respect, empathy, and the willingness to stand by each other, even when it's inconvenient. Sandra's downfall wasn't because of my defiance. It was her own selfishness that pushed everyone away. Carl eventually saw through the lies, but by then, the damage was irreversible. Living with my father, I finally experienced what it felt like to be wanted, not just tolerated. Michael never asked me to earn his love or justify my presence. He simply made space for me to exist as I am. The household was quieter, simpler, but it was filled with an honesty I had long forgotten could exist within a family. The noise of manipulation was gone, replaced by real conversations and small, genuine gestures of care. It was a kind of peace I never thought I'd get back. For those of you listening, if you've ever been in a situation where you feel like you have to beg for a place in your own family, I want you to hear this. You are not obligated to stay where you are not respected. Love that comes with conditions, guilt, or constant dismissal isn't love. It's control. Walking away doesn't mean you're giving up on family. Sometimes it's the only way to protect your heart and find the people who will truly stand with you. Sandra's last words to me were a threat that I would regret cutting her off. But as I stand here today, living a life where I'm finally seen and heard, I can tell you, I regret nothing.
If you've ever had to stand your ground against family drama, share your story in the comments. Let's build a space where respect comes first. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more stories like this. You deserve to be heard.